Jonathan Mercer leaned back in his $8,000 ergonomic chair, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office on the 38th floor. Silicon Valley sprawled before him, the California sun setting behind the Santa Cruz Mountains, bathing everything in golden light. At 43, he was the youngest CEO in the history of Vertex Technologies, a company valued at $6 billion, with offices in 14 countries and over 9,000 employees worldwide. But tonight, Jonathan wasn't thinking about stock options or quarterly reports. He was thinking about the ancient scroll, sitting in the climate-controlled case on his desk, a family heirloom passed down through generations, allegedly containing wisdom that had guided the Mercer family to prosperity for centuries. The only problem was that no one had been able to fully translate it for over 100 years. The intercom on his desk buzzed. "Mr. Mercer, the language experts you requested are here," his assistant's voice announced. Jonathan smiled. "Send them in, Vanessa." He straightened his custom-tailored Armani suit and prepared for what he considered the evening's entertainment. 5 academics filed into his office, each carrying leather briefcases and looking slightly nervous. There was Dr. Leonard Finch, linguistics professor from Stanford, Dr. Amara Washington, specialist in ancient Middle Eastern languages, Professor Nikolai Petrov, expert in dead languages, Sofia Hernandez, renowned polyglot who claimed fluency in 23 languages, and Dr. Benjamin Taylor, historical linguist specializing in ancient manuscripts. "Welcome to Vertex Technologies," Jonathan said, not bothering to stand. "I assume you all know why you're here." Dr. Finch cleared his throat. "You mentioned an ancient text requiring translation, Mr. Mercer. Something about a substantial reward." Jonathan's smile widened. "Substantial indeed. Before you is a family treasure." He gestured to the glass case, a scroll passed down through the Mercer family for generations. According to family legend, it contains wisdom that has guided our success for centuries. The last person who could fully translate it was my great-great-grandfather. He stood now, walking around his desk. "I've had dozens of experts examine it over the years. The best they can offer is fragments, bits and pieces in multiple ancient languages, seemingly intermixed in ways that make no sense. Some have suggested it's a hoax, a meaningless jumble designed to look impressive." Jonathan paused for effect. "I don't believe that, and I'm willing to bet a considerable sum on it." He looked at each expert in turn. $20 million. That's what I'm offering to whoever can translate this scroll completely and coherently." The room fell silent. $20 million was a life-changing amount of money, even for these accomplished academics. Dr. Washington was the first to speak. "And what if none of us can translate it? Then each of you owes me $100,000 for wasting my time," Jonathan replied casually. "A modest sum for professionals of your caliber, I'm sure." Professor Petrov blanched. "That seems rather excessive, Mr. Mercer." "Excessive?" Jonathan laughed. "I'm offering $20 million. What's a $100,000 gamble against that, unless you're not as confident in your abilities as your impressive resumes suggest?" The academics exchanged uncomfortable glances. None wanted to be the first to back down. "We haven't even seen the text yet," Dr. Taylor pointed out reasonably. "Fair enough." Jonathan pressed a button, and the glass case opened with a soft hiss. He carefully removed the scroll, placing it on a velvet-lined tray that he set on the conference table. "You may each examine it for 30 minutes. Then I'll expect your decision, accept my challenge, or admit your limitations." As the experts gathered around the ancient scroll, the door to Jonathan's office opened quietly, and a woman in her early 50s entered, pushing a cleaning cart. She wore a simple uniform with the name Grace embroidered on it. Her grey-streaked dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and she moved with the quiet efficiency of someone used to being invisible. "Oh, excuse me," she said softly when she noticed the gathering. "I didn't realize you were in a meeting, Mr. Mercer. I'll come back later." Jonathan waved his hand dismissively. No, stay, Grace. This won't take long, and I want my trash emptied tonight." Grace nodded and began quietly emptying the wastebaskets, keeping her eyes down and moving carefully to avoid disturbing the academics who were now huddled over the scroll, murmuring to each other with growing concern. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Washington was saying. "This section appears to be Aramaic, but then it shifts to what looks like ancient Phoenician, and here, is that Coptic? And look at this portion," Professor Petrov added. "It resembles Akkadian cuneiform, translated into Greek characters, but that makes no sense historically." As the experts continued their examination, Grace finished with the trash and began dusting the bookshelves near the conference table. Though she kept her eyes on her work, her ears caught every word of their increasingly frustrated discussion. After 30 minutes, Jonathan cleared his throat. "Time's up. What's your verdict, distinguished scholars? Ready to earn $20 million? One by one, the experts admitted their confusion. The scroll appeared to contain at least 7 ancient languages, some extinct for millennia, arranged in a pattern that defied conventional linguistic understanding. They could identify individual words and phrases, but couldn't make sense of the whole. "So no takers." Jonathan's tone was mocking. "No one willing to risk $100,000 to prove their expertise." The academics shifted uncomfortably. None was willing to stake such a sum on what seemed an impossible task. "I thought as much," Jonathan said with undisguised contempt. "The difference between you and me is that I take risks. That's why I'm sitting behind this desk and you're begging for research grants." Grace had finished dusting and was quietly mopping the floor near the door, her back to the group. At Jonathan's cruel words, her shoulders stiffened slightly, but she continued working. "That's unfair, Mr. Mercer," Dr. Finch protested. "This text appears deliberately designed to be indecipherable. The languages are anachronistic. Some didn't even exist in the same historical periods." "Excuses," Jonathan scoffed. "Always excuses from the so-called intelligent class. Tell me, what good is all your education if you can't solve real problems?" As the tension in the room mounted, Jonathan decided to escalate his entertainment. "You know what's ironic?" he said loudly. "Even Grace here probably has a better chance of figuring this out than you 5 combined." Grace paused in her mopping, but didn't turn around. "Grace," Jonathan called, "come over here a minute." She reluctantly approached the table, keeping her eyes lowered respectfully. "Grace has been cleaning my office for how long now, Grace? 8 years?" "9 years, sir," she corrected quietly. 9 years. And in those 9 years she's never once complained about her station in life, never demanded more money, never asked for special treatment. Isn't that right, Grace?" "I'm grateful for my job, Mr. Mercer," she replied simply. "See that?" Jonathan gestured grandly. "Gratitude. Something you academic types should learn." He turned to Grace. "Tell them, Grace. What level of education do you have?" Grace hesitated. "I completed high school, sir." "High school?" Jonathan laughed. "And these 5 have, what, 15 advanced degrees between them? Yet I'd wager they're not 15 times happier or 15 times wealthier than you are." Grace said nothing, her hands folded patiently before her. "In fact," Jonathan continued, warming to his cruel joke, "why don't you take a look at this ancient scroll, Grace? Who knows, maybe divine inspiration will strike where all this education has failed." The academics looked uncomfortable at Jonathan's mockery, but none spoke up to defend Grace. "It's all right, sir," Grace said softly. "I wouldn't know where to begin with something like that." "Humor me," Jonathan insisted, gesturing to the scroll. "Take a look. Consider it a break from mopping." Grace reluctantly approached the table. The scroll lay open, its weathered surface covered in what appeared to be a chaotic mixture of ancient symbols and characters. She stared at it for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then something happened that would alter the course of everyone in that room, forever. Grace's eyes widened slightly. She leaned closer, her fingers hovering just above the surface of the ancient parchment without touching it. "May I?" she asked quietly. Jonathan smirked. By all means, show us your hidden talents, Grace. Grace studied the scroll intently for several minutes, while everyone watched with varying degrees of amusement and discomfort. Then, to everyone's astonishment, she began to speak. The wisdom of the ages is not found in towers of pride, but in valleys of humility, she recited, her voice suddenly clear and confident. Those who seek to elevate themselves above others will find only emptiness at the summit. The room fell completely silent. Jonathan's smirk froze on his face. True power lies not in commanding others, but in serving them, Grace continued, her eyes moving across the text with surprising fluidity. The greatest leader is the one who kneels to help the lowest among his people. Dr. Washington gasped. How are you doing this? Grace didn't answer, continuing her translation. Wealth accumulated for its own sake turns to poison in the soul. Wealth shared becomes an everlasting fountain. Jonathan's face had lost all color. This is some kind of trick, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Grace looked up from the scroll, meeting Jonathan's eyes directly for perhaps the first time in 9 years. It's not a trick, Mr. Mercer. I can read this. That's impossible, Professor Petrov sputtered. That text contains Aramaic, Phoenician, Ancient Greek, and languages that haven't been spoken in 3,000 years. Yes, Grace acknowledged simply. It does. And you can read them all? Dr. Finch asked incredulously. I can, she replied. Jonathan had recovered enough to narrow his eyes suspiciously. If this is some kind of con, it's not a con, Grace interrupted gently. Would you like me to continue the translation? Please do, Dr. Washington urged, before Jonathan could respond. Grace turned back to the scroll. For the next 30 minutes, she translated seamlessly from the jumble of ancient languages, revealing a text of profound wisdom about humility, service, the proper use of wealth and power, and the true meaning of success. The academics listened in stunned silence, occasionally nodding when she translated particularly difficult passages that they had partially deciphered. When she finished, Grace stepped back from the table, once again folding her hands before her. The silence that followed was deafening. Who are you? Jonathan finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace sighed. Just who you see, Mr. Mercer. Grace Abernathy, your cleaning lady for the past 9 years. No one is just a cleaning lady who can translate 7 ancient languages, Dr. Taylor said, finding his voice at last. How? Jonathan demanded. How is this possible? Grace was quiet for a moment, then seemed to make a decision. 25 years ago, I was Dr. Grace Abernathy, professor of ancient Near Eastern languages at Princeton University. I had 3 PhDs and was considered one of the leading scholars in my field. The academics gasped. Dr. Washington covered her mouth. I've read your work. Your translation of the Dead Sea Scrolls was groundbreaking, but you disappeared from academia over 20 years ago. Everyone wondered what happened to you. Grace's expression remained serene, though her eyes reflected old pain. Life happened, Dr. Washington. My husband was also an academic. He couldn't handle that my career was outpacing his. When I was offered a prestigious position at Oxford that he had coveted, She paused. He sabotaged my research and planted evidence that I had plagiarized my most significant work. No, Dr. Finch exclaimed. Yes, Grace said simply. In academia, reputation is everything. Once mine was destroyed, no university would touch me. Former colleagues wouldn't return my calls. I was suddenly persona non grata in the world I had dedicated my life to. But surely you could have fought back, proved your innocence, Professor Petrov suggested. I tried, Grace replied. But my husband was well connected and very convincing. And then I discovered I was pregnant with my daughter Rachel. I needed stability income, so I reinvented myself. I took jobs cleaning offices and homes to support us. Jonathan stared at Grace as if seeing her for the first time. For 20 years, you've been cleaning offices with your qualifications? 22 years, Grace corrected gently. And yes, it's honest work that allowed me to raise my daughter. Rachel graduated from medical school last year. She's doing her residency in pediatric oncology now. The room fell silent again as everyone processed this revelation. The 5 academics looked both ashamed and amazed. Jonathan appeared completely stunned. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" he finally asked. 9 years, Grace. 9 years you've been cleaning my office, emptying my trash, listening to my phone calls, my business deals, knowing at least 7 ancient languages that even these experts can barely identify. Grace met his gaze steadily. "You never asked, Mr. Mercer. Not once in 9 years did you ask me anything about myself beyond whether I could work late when you had an important meeting." The truth of her words hit Jonathan like a physical blow. He had never seen Grace, really seen her, until this moment. "Well," he said, struggling to regain his composure, "it appears we have a winner of our little contest." He forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. $20 million as promised. "I don't want your money, Mr. Mercer," Grace said quietly. "Don't be ridiculous. We had a deal." "I wasn't part of your deal," Grace pointed out. "I was just emptying your trash, remember?" Jonathan stared at her, confounded. In his experience, everyone had a price. Everyone wanted money. "Then what do you want?" Grace considered the question carefully. "I want you to recognize that the people you pass every day without noticing, the janitors, the maintenance workers, the administrative assistants, the food service staff, are not defined by their jobs. They have stories, talents, dreams, and dignity that have nothing to do with their employment status or their bank accounts." The academics nodded in agreement, looking increasingly uncomfortable with their earlier silence in the face of Jonathan's mockery. "And," Grace continued, "I would like you to fund scholarships for women re-entering academia after career interruptions, especially those who faced obstacles due to family obligations or workplace discrimination." Jonathan found himself nodding. "Consider it done, but that can't be all." "It's not," Grace admitted. "There's something else, but it's not something you can give me. It's something you need to discover for yourself." "What's that?" Jonathan asked, genuinely curious now. "Why this scroll was so important to you in the first place," Grace said. "It wasn't about the money for you. You have plenty. It was about something else. Perhaps about finding meaning beyond wealth and power." Jonathan felt exposed, as if Grace had somehow read not just the ancient scroll, but his very thoughts. He had been feeling increasingly empty despite his success, wondering if there was more to life than the endless accumulation of wealth and influence. "The scroll mentions a treasure beyond price," Grace continued gently. "It's not talking about money or power, Mr. Mercer. It's talking about wisdom, compassion, and faith." "Faith?" Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Are you religious, Grace?" "I'm a Christian," she replied simply. "My faith has sustained me through some very dark times." Jonathan had always dismissed religion as a crutch for the weak or uneducated. But here was Grace, clearly brilliant, educated, and remarkably strong, speaking of faith with quiet conviction. "The scroll actually contains several biblical principles," Grace explained, "though expressed through the languages and idioms of various ancient cultures. The section about leaders washing the feet of those they lead is a direct reference to Jesus washing his disciples' feet, a radical act of humility and service from the greatest to the least." Jonathan processed this information slowly. "So my family's ancient wisdom scroll is Christian?" "Not explicitly," Grace clarified. "It draws from many traditions. But at its heart, it speaks to universal truths that align with Christ's teachings, that true greatness comes through service, that pride precedes a fall, that how we treat the least among us reveals our true character." The 5 academics had been listening to this exchange with fascination. Now, Dr. Washington spoke up. "Grace, Dr. Abernathy, would you be willing to work with us to properly document this scroll? It appears to be a unique historical artifact." Grace smiled. I would be happy to collaborate as a consultant, Dr. Washington, but I'm not looking to return to academia full-time. Why not? Professor Petrov asked. Surely this translation alone would restore your reputation. Perhaps, Grace acknowledged, but I've found unexpected blessings in my so-called lesser life. I've had time to be fully present for my daughter. I've met extraordinary people I would never have encountered in the ivory tower. And I've learned humility in ways that have deepened my faith. She turned to Jonathan. The scroll warns against the poison of pride, Mr. Mercer. I experienced that poison firsthand in my previous life. Academic arrogance, intellectual competition, the constant need to prove my worth through achievements and accolades. In many ways, losing everything saved me from that poison. Jonathan felt a strange sensation in his chest, a mixture of shame and longing. But don't you feel wasted? All that education, all that potential spent cleaning offices? Grace's smile deepened. No work that serves others is wasted, Mr. Mercer, and potential isn't just measured in professional achievements or bank accounts. Sometimes our greatest potential is realized in how we love, how we persevere, how we maintain our integrity in difficult circumstances. As the night progressed, Jonathan's office became the setting for an extraordinary conversation. The 5 academics, humbled by Grace's knowledge and her story, asked thoughtful questions about both the scroll and her life journey. Jonathan mostly listened, absorbing a perspective entirely foreign to his worldview. Around midnight, as the conversation was winding down, Jonathan made a decision. Grace, he said, I'd like to offer you a position at Vertex Technologies. As what? She asked, genuinely curious. As whatever you want to be, he replied. Director of Historical Research, Chief Wisdom Officer, Consultant on Ancient Languages. Create your own title, but I want your voice in my company. Grace considered this. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Mercer, but I'd need to think about it. This has been quite a night for all of us. Of course, Jonathan agreed. Take all the time you need. He hesitated, then added, and regardless of your decision, I intend to honor your request about the scholarships. In fact, I'd like to establish them in your name, the Grace Abernathy Fellowships for Women in Academia. For the first time that evening, Grace looked genuinely moved. Thank you. That would mean a great deal to me. As the academics gathered their things to leave, each thanking Grace and exchanging contact information, Jonathan remained seated at the conference table, staring at the ancient scroll. When everyone had gone except Grace, he looked up at her. You know, I never actually believed anyone could translate this. I just wanted to feel superior to people who had the kind of education I lacked. I know, Grace said gently. 9 years. Jonathan mused. 9 years you've watched me swagger and boast and treat people like objects rather than humans. You must despise me. I don't despise you, Mr. Mercer, Grace replied. I've prayed for you. Prayed for me? Jonathan looked surprised. Why? Because I recognize something in you that you might not see in yourself, a hunger for meaning that all your success hasn't satisfied. Tonight wasn't really about the scroll, was it? It was about finding something real in a life that started to feel hollow. Jonathan stared at her, astonished at her perception. How could you possibly know that? Because I've seen it before, in myself, in colleagues, in many successful people. There comes a point when achievements and acquisitions no longer fill the emptiness, when you start asking if this is all there is. Jonathan's throat tightened. And what's your answer to that question, Grace? Is this all there is? No, she said with quiet certainty. There's so much more. There's purpose beyond success, community beyond networking, joy beyond pleasure, and hope beyond ambition. Found in faith? Jonathan asked, not mockingly now, but with genuine curiosity. For me, yes, Grace acknowledged. But everyone's journey is different. The scroll mentions that wisdom begins with humility, the recognition that we don't have all the answers. Perhaps that's where your journey begins, Mr. Mercer. Jonathan nodded slowly, feeling both unsettled and strangely hopeful. I think I have a lot to learn. We all do, Grace said with a smile. That's part of the adventure. She began gathering her cleaning supplies, preparing to leave. Grace, Jonathan called as she reached the door. Thank you, not just for the translation, but for seeing me, the real me behind all this. He gestured to his opulent office. God has always seen the real you, Mr. Mercer, Grace replied. I'm just following his example. After she left, Jonathan sat alone in his office for a long time, the ancient scroll still open before him. For the first time in years, possibly decades, he felt a stirring of genuine curiosity about something that couldn't be bought, sold, or leveraged for profit. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to learn from his cleaning lady than from all the business gurus and self-help books he'd consulted over the years, and perhaps it was time to explore the faith that had sustained Grace through trials that would have broken most people. With careful hands, Jonathan rolled up the scroll, placed it back in its case, and turned off the lights in his office. Tomorrow would be the beginning of something new. He wasn't sure what exactly, but for the first time in a very long time, he was looking forward to finding out. 3 months after the night that changed everything, Jonathan Mercer stood nervously in the atrium of Vertex Technologies headquarters. The space had been transformed for today's ceremony, the official launch of the Grace Abernathy Fellowships for Women in Academia. Around him, employees, academics, press, and special guests mingled, all curious about the dramatic shift in both Jonathan's personal demeanor and his company's priorities over the past quarter. 15 minutes until we start, Mr. Mercer, his assistant Vanessa reminded him. Thanks, Vanessa, and please, I've told you, it's Jonathan. Vanessa smiled. After 8 years of maintaining strict professional formality, her boss's new insistence on first names had taken some getting used to, but it was just one of many changes. Jonathan scanned the crowd, looking for Grace. After that fateful night, he had given her time to consider his job offer, not pressuring her for an answer. 2 weeks later, she had proposed something unexpected. She would join Vertex Technologies, not as an executive or consultant, but as the director of a new charitable foundation focused on educational equity and second chances. Jonathan had agreed immediately, allocating $50 million as initial funding. The Grace Abernathy Fellowships were just the beginning. The foundation was already developing programs for first-generation college students, career retraining for displaced workers, and educational support for single parents. He spotted Grace across the atrium, speaking with Dr. Washington and several university administrators. She looked different today, still modest and unassuming, but dressed in a professional suit rather than a cleaner's uniform. Her grey-streaked hair styled simply but elegantly. What hadn't changed was the serene confidence in her bearing. Next to Grace stood a young woman in her late 20s, with the same warm eyes and gentle smile. Rachel, Grace's daughter, who had taken a weekend away from her medical residency to support her mother on this important day. As Jonathan watched them, he reflected on the past 3 months. After that night in his office, he had found himself unable to return to business as usual. The next morning, he had called a meeting of his executive team and announced a comprehensive review of employment practices, compensation structures, and corporate culture at Vertex Technologies. The review had revealed uncomfortable truths. Cleaning staff and maintenance workers were employed through contractors that paid minimum wage with no benefits. Administrative assistants, predominantly women, had virtually no path to promotion regardless of their qualifications. The corporate environment rewarded aggressive self-promotion over collaborative problem-solving. Jonathan had set about changing everything, facing resistance from long-time executives who had thrived in the cutthroat culture he had created. Several had resigned in protest. Jonathan had wished them well and continued the transformation. but the professional changes weren't the most significant shift in his life. 2 days after meeting the real Grace Abernathy, Jonathan had done something he hadn't done since childhood. He had gone to church. It had been awkward at first. He had chosen a small community church, hoping to avoid recognition, and had sat in the back row feeling decidedly out of place. But the message that day, about seeing others as God sees them, had resonated deeply. He had continued attending, gradually moving from the back row to the middle, eventually joining a small group Bible study where, to his surprise, no one cared about his wealth or status. They cared about his questions, his struggles, his journey. 3 weeks ago he had been baptized. Grace had been there, smiling from the congregation. 5 minutes, sir. I mean Jonathan, Vanessa reminded him, pulling him from his reflections. He nodded and made his way toward the small stage that had been set up. As he approached, Grace saw him and smiled. "Nervous?" she asked. "Terrified," he admitted. "I'm used to giving speeches about profit margins and market share, not transformation and second chances." "You'll do wonderfully," Grace assured him. "Just speak from the heart." "That's the terrifying part," Jonathan confessed. "I'm still learning how to do that." Grace's daughter Rachel extended her hand. "It's nice to finally meet you, Mr. Mercer. Mom has told me a lot about you." "All bad, I'm sure," Jonathan joked self-deprecatingly as he shook her hand. "Actually, no," Rachel replied thoughtfully. "She's told me about your courage." "My courage?" Jonathan was genuinely surprised. "It takes courage to question everything you've built your life around," Rachel explained. "Mom says you've done that with remarkable honesty." Before Jonathan could respond, the event coordinator signaled that it was time to begin. He took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage, facing the gathered crowd. "Good morning," he began. "Many of you are wondering why Vertex Technologies, a company known for its aggressive pursuit of market dominance and profit maximization, is suddenly launching a fellowship program for women in academia." He paused. "It's a fair question. The answer begins with a story about an ancient scroll, a ridiculous bet, and a cleaning lady who changed everything." For the next 15 minutes, Jonathan shared the story of that night 3 months ago, omitting certain personal details out of respect for Grace's privacy, but conveying the essential truth that he had encountered authentic wisdom in the most unexpected place, and it had transformed his understanding of success, value, and purpose. "The Grace Abernathy Fellowships," he concluded, "represent more than financial support for women pursuing academic careers. They represent our company's commitment to recognizing the extraordinary potential in people who have been overlooked, undervalued, or pushed aside. They represent our belief that true success isn't measured in stock prices or profit margins, but in human dignity and second chances." He gestured toward Grace. "I'm honored to introduce the woman whose courage, integrity, and wisdom inspired this initiative, Dr. Grace Abernathy." The applause was thunderous as Grace approached the podium. She spoke briefly but powerfully about her journey, the obstacles she had faced, and her vision for the fellowships that bore her name. "Second chances aren't just about returning to past glory," she emphasized. "They're about discovering new purpose, often greater than what we originally planned for ourselves. My prayer for each fellowship recipient is that they will find not just professional success, but meaningful purpose that transcends academic achievement." After the formal ceremony concluded, Jonathan found himself surrounded by well-wishers and curious reporters. He answered questions patiently, no longer the brusque, dismissive executive he had once been. Later, as the crowd thinned, he spotted Grace sitting quietly with her daughter in a corner of the atrium. "May I join you?" he asked. "Of course," Grace smiled, making room on the bench. "That was quite a speech, Mr. Mercer," Rachel said. "Very different from your CNBC interviews." Jonathan laughed. "Yes, well, I was a different person then." "Speaking of which," Grace said, reaching into her bag, "I brought something for you." She handed him a small wrapped package. Jonathan opened it carefully to find a beautifully bound journal. Inside, on the first page, was written a verse. "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Romans 12, verse 2. "I thought you might like to document your journey," Grace explained. "The transformation you're experiencing doesn't happen overnight. There will be struggles ahead, doubts, 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Writing can help clarify your thoughts." Jonathan was touched by her thoughtfulness. "Thank you, Grace. I'll treasure this." "Mom's big on journals," Rachel commented with affection. "She kept detailed ones throughout my childhood, gave them to me when I graduated medical school. The story of our life together, all the challenges and blessings. They've been a form of prayer for me," Grace added, "a way of processing life with God." Jonathan nodded, turning the journal over in his hands. "I'm still learning how to pray. It doesn't come naturally after 43 years of self-reliance." "Prayer isn't about perfect words," Grace said gently. "It's about honest conversation. God already knows your thoughts anyway. Prayer just brings them into the open." "Like good therapy," Rachel added with a smile. "Speaking of therapy," Jonathan said, "I've been seeing someone, a counselor, trying to understand why I built my identity around achievement and wealth for so long." "That's wonderful," Grace said warmly. "Self-awareness is essential to genuine change." "It's humbling," Jonathan admitted, "realizing how much of my behavior was driven by insecurity, by a desperate need to prove my worth through success." "The scroll warned about that," Grace reminded him. "A man's worth is not measured by his possessions or position, but by the condition of his heart." Jonathan nodded thoughtfully. "My therapist said something similar, though less poetically. He suggested that my drive for wealth and power was really a misguided search for significance." "And are you finding significance elsewhere now?" Rachel asked. "I'm beginning to," Jonathan replied. "In my faith journey, in authentic relationships, in using my resources to create opportunities for others rather than just building my own empire." He smiled ruefully. "It's a work in progress." "As we all are," Grace assured him. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as the last of the event staff cleared away chairs and decorations. "I have a question," Jonathan said finally. "Something I've been wondering since that night." He hesitated. "The scroll, you said it contained wisdom from many traditions, but with principles that align with Christian teaching. Was it really my family's ancestral wisdom scroll?" Grace's eyes twinkled. "The scroll is certainly ancient and valuable. The languages and contents are exactly as I translated them. As for its provenance," she shrugged slightly, "only you can answer whether it truly guided your family for generations." Jonathan considered this. "My father gave it to me on his deathbed. He said it had been passed down through the Mercer family for generations, but that no one had been able to fully translate it for a century. He told me it contained wisdom I would need when material success wasn't enough anymore." "Perhaps your father had more insight than you realized," Grace suggested. "Perhaps," Jonathan agreed. "Or perhaps the true value of the scroll wasn't in its historical connection to my family, but in what it revealed to me at exactly the right moment in my life." Grace smiled. "God works in mysterious ways, Mr. Mercer." "Indeed he does, Dr. Abernathy," Jonathan replied with a smile of his own. "Indeed he does." As the three of them prepared to leave, Jonathan found himself filled with a sense of gratitude, unlike anything he had experienced in his previous life of wealth and achievement. The scroll had promised that true wealth came not from accumulation, but from generosity, not from elevation, but from service. He was beginning to understand that promise now, in ways his former self could never have imagined. The journey ahead would not be easy. Changing deeply ingrained patterns of thinking and behavior never was. But for the first time, he was walking a path that offered genuine meaning rather than mere success. And he had a humble cleaning lady, no, a brilliant scholar, a person of profound faith, a woman of extraordinary character, to thank for showing him the way. 6 months after the launch of the Grace Abernathy Fellowships, Jonathan stood in the lobby of Vertex Technologies headquarters, greeting the company's maintenance and custodial staff as they arrived for their shift. This had become his Friday morning ritual, personally connecting with employees he would have previously ignored entirely. "Good morning, Thomas. How's your son doing in his new school?" Jonathan asked a maintenance technician. "Much better, Mr. Mercer. That tutor the foundation helped us find has made all the difference with his dyslexia," Thomas replied with evident gratitude. "Wonderful. Keep me updated," Jonathan said, moving on to greet the next person. Ever since the company had ended its contracts with external cleaning services and brought all facility staff in-house as full employees with benefits and growth opportunities, morale had soared. Absenteeism had plummeted. Even more surprisingly, innovation had increased across all departments. Jonathan's executive team, now more diverse than ever, attributed this to the company's radical cultural shift. When people felt valued regardless of their role, they contributed ideas and spotted problems they would have previously kept to themselves. As the last of the morning shift workers headed to their stations, Jonathan noticed a familiar figure entering the lobby, Grace Abernathy, carrying a cardboard box. "Grace, I didn't expect to see you today," Jonathan greeted her warmly. The Grace Abernathy Foundation operated from its own offices 3 blocks away. "I found something I thought you'd want to see," she explained, lifting the box slightly. "Do you have a few minutes?" "For you? Always." Jonathan led her to a quiet corner of the lobby where comfortable chairs were arranged around a low table, another change from the previous sterile, intimidating entrance area. Grace set the box down and took a seat. "I've been going through some of my old academic materials, things I'd stored away 20 years ago when I left that life behind." "Find anything interesting?" Jonathan asked. "Many things," Grace smiled. "But this in particular caught my attention." She opened the box and carefully removed an old leather folder. "What is it?" Jonathan leaned forward curiously. "During my doctoral studies, I specialized in comparative religious texts, documents that showed connections between different faith traditions and cultures. My dissertation focused on what I called wisdom parallels, core ethical principles that appeared across diverse ancient texts." She opened the folder to reveal yellowed papers covered in Grace's handwriting, alongside photocopies of what appeared to be ancient manuscripts. "One of my research projects involved tracing 7 key wisdom principles through different ancient languages and traditions. I was particularly interested in how these principles were expressed in Aramaic, Phoenician, Ancient Greek, and other languages of the Near East and Mediterranean." Jonathan's eyes widened as he began to understand. "You mean I created a comparative table," Grace continued, "showing how each principle was expressed in these various languages, a sort of linguistic tapestry demonstrating the universality of certain ethical concepts." She turned a page to reveal a complex chart with 7 rows, each containing the same concept written in different ancient scripts. The 7 principles were humility, service, generosity, integrity, wisdom, compassion, and purpose, Grace explained. "The same 7 principles expressed in your family's scroll." Jonathan stared at the chart, then at Grace, his mind racing. "Are you saying the scroll—" "I'm not saying anything definitive," Grace clarified. "Just sharing an interesting coincidence. This research was published in an obscure academic journal over 25 years ago. Very few people outside my specific field would have ever seen it." Jonathan sat back, processing this revelation. "So there's a possibility that the ancient family scroll my father gave me was actually, as I said, just an interesting coincidence," Grace replied mildly. "Though I will say this. Whether the scroll itself was ancient or not, the wisdom it contained certainly was. Those principles have guided believers and philosophers for thousands of years." Jonathan was quiet for a moment. "If the scroll was created based on your research, That would mean my father deliberately sought out these wisdom principles to pass on to me, that he knew someday I would need them. That would suggest a father who knew his son very well and who cared deeply about his spiritual well-being, Grace observed. Jonathan's eyes misted unexpectedly. His relationship with his father had been complicated. A driven, successful businessman who had always pushed Jonathan to achieve more, be more, earn more. They had rarely discussed matters of faith or meaning. I never thought of my father as particularly spiritual, Jonathan said quietly. He was all about results, success, winning at all costs. At least, that's what he showed me. Sometimes, parents show different faces to their children than they show to others, Grace suggested. They try to give their children what they think they need most. But why not just tell me directly? Why create this elaborate scenario with an ancient family scroll? Grace smiled. Would you have listened? The ambitious young Jonathan Mercer, future tech mogul, on his way to conquering Silicon Valley. Jonathan chuckled ruefully. No, definitely not. Sometimes wisdom has to find us when we're ready to receive it, Grace said. Not when others are ready to give it. Jonathan reached out and gently touched the research papers. May I keep these for a while to study them? Of course, Grace agreed. They're copies of my original work. You're welcome to them. As Grace prepared to leave, Jonathan walked her to the door. Grace, he said hesitantly, do you think my father planned all this? That he somehow knew you would end up cleaning my office, that you would be there the night I finally had the scroll translated? Grace considered the question thoughtfully. I think that's giving your father more credit for orchestration than any human deserves. But I do believe in divine orchestration, what some might call coincidence, others call providence. God's timing, Jonathan said. Yes, Grace nodded. In my experience, God often works through seemingly random connections and timing that in retrospect appear almost impossibly perfect. They're like a brilliant cleaning lady with 3 PhDs being present exactly when an arrogant CEO needs his perspective completely upended, Jonathan suggested with a smile. Exactly like that, Grace agreed, returning his smile. The scroll itself says, divine wisdom appears in unexpected places, speaking through unexpected voices. Those who have ears to hear must listen wherever truth presents itself. As Grace departed, Jonathan returned to his office, carrying the box with her research papers. He set it on his desk beside the ancient scroll case, which now occupied a place of honor rather than being a mere conversation piece to impress visitors. Opening his drawer, he removed the journal Grace had given him, now half filled with his thoughts, prayers, and reflections on his ongoing spiritual journey. He opened to a fresh page and began to write, Today I learned that the scroll that changed my life might have originated in Grace's academic work from 25 years ago. If true, this means my father deliberately sought out timeless wisdom to pass on to me, knowing I would someday need it more than money or status. It means he saw in me a hunger for meaning that I didn't yet recognize in myself. I find myself wondering who my father really was behind the hard-driving businessman I thought I knew. What spiritual journey was he on that he never shared with me? What wisdom had he discovered that he tried to pass on in the only way he thought I might eventually accept? I've been so focused on my own transformation these past 9 months that I haven't considered how this insight changes my understanding of him. Perhaps there was more depth, more compassion, more spiritual awareness in my father than I ever gave him credit for. God, help me see others, even those I think I know well, with fresh eyes. Help me recognize that each person has depths I cannot fathom and wisdom I might need. Help me listen with humility to unexpected voices and find your truth in unexpected places. He closed the journal and gazed out his office window at the Silicon Valley landscape. 9 months ago he had looked out at the same view with the eyes of a conqueror surveying his domain. Now he saw a community of people, each with their own story, their own value, their own unique contribution to make. The scroll, Whoever had created it had been right. True wealth wasn't found in accumulation, but in generosity. True greatness wasn't found in elevation, but in service. And true wisdom began with the humility to recognize that the cleaning lady might have more to teach the CEO than he could possibly imagine. 1 year to the day after the night that had transformed his life, Jonathan hosted a special dinner at his home. The guest list was small but significant. Grace and her daughter Rachel, the 5 academics who had witnessed Grace's revelation, key members of the Grace Abernathy Foundation team, and Pastor Michael from the community church Jonathan now attended regularly. His home, once a showcase of wealth designed to impress, had been remodeled to be warm and welcoming. What had previously been a trophy room displaying his awards and acquisitions was now a comfortable library filled with books on theology, philosophy, and social justice. As the guests mingled before dinner, Jonathan noticed Grace standing alone, examining the scroll that was now displayed in a simple but elegant case in the library. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, joining her. Grace smiled. "I was just reflecting on how much has changed in a year." "It's been quite a journey," Jonathan agreed, "for both of us." "For many people," Grace corrected gently. "The foundation has already provided fellowships to 17 women returning to academia. Vertex Technologies now has one of the most progressive employment policies in the tech industry, and your personal example has influenced other CEOs to reconsider their corporate cultures." Jonathan shook his head in wonder. "All because you were emptying my trash on the right night." "All because you were finally ready to hear the message," Grace countered, "and because God orchestrated a moment of revelation when it would bear the most fruit." The dinner that followed was filled with laughter, thoughtful conversation, and genuine connection. Jonathan observed with satisfaction how comfortable everyone seemed, from Rachel, now chief resident in pediatric oncology, to Thomas, the maintenance technician who had been invited with his family in recognition of his suggestions that had improved workplace safety throughout the company. After dessert, Jonathan stood and tapped his glass for attention. "Thank you all for coming tonight. This anniversary means a great deal to me, as each of you has played a significant role in what I can only describe as the transformation of my life." He paused, looking around the table. "A year ago, I was wealthy but impoverished, successful but empty, surrounded by people but profoundly alone." Several guests nodded in understanding. "What happened that night?" Grace's translation of the scroll, the revelation of her true identity, the wisdom she shared so generously, cracked open a door that had been closed my entire adult life, a door to authentic meaning, purpose, and faith. Jonathan turned to Grace. "I've thanked you many times over the past year, but I want to say again, publicly, how grateful I am for your courage and integrity. You could have simply endured my arrogance in silence, as you had for 9 years. Instead, you chose to reveal yourself at great personal risk, not knowing how I would respond." Grace smiled, slightly embarrassed by the attention. "I simply followed what I felt God was calling me to do in that moment. And in doing so, you changed not just my life, but the lives of countless others through the ripple effects of that decision." Jonathan continued. "The fellowships, the foundation, the changes at Vertex, none of that would have happened if you had remained silent that night." Pastor Michael spoke up. "This reminds me of Esther in the Bible, placed in a position of influence for such a time as this. Grace was in your office for 9 years, Jonathan, but it was that specific night when everything aligned for transformation to occur. Which brings me to an announcement," Jonathan said. "After much prayer and consideration, I've decided to step down as CEO of Vertex Technologies." A murmur of surprise rippled around the table. "Don't worry," Jonathan smiled. "The company isn't in trouble. Quite the opposite. Our new ethical approach to business has actually improved our bottom line, contradicting everything I used to believe about cutthroat competition being necessary for success." "Then why leave?" Dr. Washington asked. Because I've been called to something new, Jonathan explained. I'll remain on the board, but I'm transferring leadership to our current COO, Diane Matthews, who has embraced our new corporate values while maintaining operational excellence. What will you do? Grace asked, genuine curiosity in her eyes. I'm establishing a new initiative called Second Chance Ventures, Jonathan announced. We'll provide funding, mentorship and support to entrepreneurs who have faced significant setbacks or barriers, people re-entering the workforce after incarceration, recovering from addiction, or rebuilding after personal or professional disaster. That sounds wonderful, Rachel commented. It's inspired by Grace's story, Jonathan acknowledged, and by the scroll's wisdom about the transformative power of second chances. But there's more to the announcement. He reached under the table and brought out 7 leather-bound books. These are reproductions of the scroll, translated into modern English, with commentary and practical applications for today's world. With Grace's help and the input of scholars from various faith traditions, we've created what we're calling the Wisdom Legacy Project. Jonathan handed one of the books to each person at the table. These aren't for sale. They're gifts for people who have impacted my journey. But we will be making the content freely available online and in print for anyone seeking the same wisdom that transformed my life. Dr. Finch opened his copy with interest. This is remarkable, Jonathan. You've taken ancient wisdom and made it accessible without diluting its power. That was our goal, Jonathan agreed, to honor the original message while helping modern readers apply it to their lives. As the evening drew to a close, guests began to depart, each thanking Jonathan for his hospitality and expressing excitement about his new venture. Eventually, only Grace, Rachel, and Pastor Michael remained. I have a confession to make, Jonathan said, as they sat in the library with cups of coffee. I've been studying your original research, Grace, the comparative wisdom principles you documented 25 years ago. Grace nodded, unsurprised. I thought you might. I've also had the scroll carbon-dated and analyzed by experts, Jonathan continued. It's definitely not centuries old. The parchment dates to approximately 25 years ago, though the scribing technique is authentic to ancient methods. So your father did create it based on Mum's research, Rachel concluded. It appears so, Jonathan agreed. I've been trying to piece together how and why. My father wasn't an academic, but he served on several university boards, including Princeton's when Grace was teaching there. I remember meeting him at a fundraising event, Grace said quietly. He asked thoughtful questions about my research, one of the few non-academics who seemed genuinely interested in the substance rather than just making polite conversation. What I still don't understand, Jonathan admitted, is why he went to such lengths. Why create an elaborate family heirloom rather than simply sharing these principles directly? Pastor Michael leaned forward. May I offer a perspective? Sometimes parents recognize qualities in their children that concern them, patterns that might lead to future unhappiness, but direct advice is often rejected, especially by strong-willed, independent children. Jonathan smiled ruefully. That certainly described me. Your father may have recognized your drive for success and achievement, Pastor Michael suggested. Perhaps he saw how that same drive had affected his own life and relationships. Maybe he wanted to give you something that would be there when you eventually hit the wall of emptiness that success without meaning creates. A time capsule of wisdom, Rachel suggested, designed to activate when you needed it most. But how could he know Grace would be there that night, Jonathan wondered. He couldn't, Grace said simply. That part was divine orchestration, not human planning. Your father planted the seed, but God arranged for it to bear fruit at precisely the right moment. Jonathan nodded slowly, finding comfort in this explanation. So, my father did care about more than just my success. He cared about my soul. And he found a creative way to reach it when traditional father-son advice would have fallen on deaf ears, Pastor Michael affirmed. As the evening concluded and Jonathan walked his final guests to the door, Grace paused on the threshold. "Your father would be proud of the man you've become, Jonathan," she said gently. "Not because of your success or wealth, but because you found the courage to seek true wisdom." "I had help," Jonathan replied with a grateful smile. "A divinely appointed cleaning lady with 3 PhDs and a heart full of grace." Grace chuckled. "God works with what's available." "In this case, a middle-aged woman with a mop and a lot of languages in her head. And faith in her heart," Jonathan added. "Don't forget that part. It made all the difference." After they left, Jonathan returned to the library, sitting quietly before the scroll case. He thought about his father, the driven businessman he had known, and the spiritually aware man he was only now discovering. He thought about Grace, brilliant scholar turned cleaning lady, turned foundation director, whose humility and faith had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of countless others. And he thought about his own journey, from arrogant CEO to humble seeker, from success-obsessed achiever to purpose-driven servant. The scroll had promised that true wealth came not from what one accumulated, but from what one gave away. True wisdom came not from intellectual achievement, but from spiritual insight. And true transformation began not with grand gestures, but with simple humility. 1 year ago, he had challenged 5 experts to translate an ancient text, certain they would fail and he would triumph. Instead, a cleaning lady had translated not just the scroll, but his very soul, helping him read the wisdom that had been there all along, waiting for him to develop eyes to see and ears to hear. As he prepared for bed, Jonathan opened the journal Grace had given him and wrote a final entry for this significant anniversary. "Today marks 1 year since the night everything changed. I've come to believe that my father created the scroll as a gift to my future self, a self he knew would eventually hunger for meaning beyond success. And I believe God orchestrated events so that Grace would be present exactly when I needed her wisdom most. The greatest translation wasn't of the scroll, but of my life, from emptiness to purpose, from achievement to meaning, from isolation to community, from pride to humility. Grace didn't just translate ancient languages. She helped translate faith into terms my skeptical mind could finally understand. The scroll says, "The greatest journey is not from poverty to wealth, but from blindness to sight. I was blind to so much. The value of people regardless of status, the emptiness of success without purpose, the possibility of faith in a skeptical age. Tomorrow begins a new chapter as I launch Second Chance Ventures. I've been given a second chance at a meaningful life. Now it's time to pass that gift on to others who need it just as desperately as I did. Thank you, Father, for your wisdom disguised as an ancient scroll. Thank you, Grace, for your courage disguised as a cleaning lady. And thank you, God, for your love disguised as coincidence, orchestrating it all with perfect timing. The journey continues,